Welcome to the Success in Africa podcast with Dr. Modupe, your weekly dose of leadership vitamins to make you successful in Africa.
Hello, and welcome to the Success in Africa Leadership podcast, episode 13. My name is Dr. Modupe Taylor-Pierce, and I am a scholar and practitioner of leadership and organizational development, which simply means I specialize in the study of what makes people and organizations successful. I've been doing this for 3 decades, and in this podcast, I generally tend to share tips, knowledge for how to be successful in Africa, because that is where I have focused most of my work. Now, in typical episodes, I share knowledge and tips, and I usually feature somebody in Africa having success. But in this episode, I'm actually going to do things a little bit differently, and I'm going to answer a few of the questions that you have asked me about the previous episodes. Now, I can't believe that it's already been 3 months and we're on our 13th episode. And I want to say thank you to all of you who have supported and continue to support this podcast. This podcast is brought to you by BCA Leadership, the largest leadership enhancement company in Africa. So let's get into it, all right? Because if you've been listening to this podcast already, you know why I do this, because I'm just sick and tired of Africa being poor. And I know that the secret to Africa being wealthy is Africans becoming wealthy. And that is Africans achieving their dreams of success. So I've shared a number of things in previous episodes. I encourage you, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, go back to the previous episodes. But for today, I am going to focus on questions that have been asked of me. So some of these, if you haven't watched the previous episodes, you might struggle to understand what we're talking about. I hope you won't, but certainly continue to listen. And if you do find out that there are things you don't understand, just go back, watch the previous episodes. All right, let's get into it. Okay, I have chosen 4 questions to answer because, as all of you know, this podcast is only has a limit of 15 minutes, and I want to make sure that we move snappily, and I've chosen 4 out of the number of questions that I've had. So the first question I've picked comes from the episode that I think probably generated the greatest amount of buzz, and I'm not sure whether it was because of the content or the title, and this was episode 11, Potbellied Leaders Are Bad for Africa. So somebody asked the question, says, I hear what you are saying about the pot-bellied leader, but what of those leaders without potbellies who are equally as bad? What do we use to tell? All right, so thank you first of all for this question. Yes, I'm reminded of my early psych teacher who always told me that, John is a boy. All Johns are boys, but not all boys are called John. So you're correct. Indeed, part of the hypothesis that I shared is that pot-bellied leaders are bad for Africa. Why? Because a potbelly is an indication of a lack of self-discipline. And undisciplined or indisciplined leaders are bad for Africa, because when you don't have self-discipline, then you're not going to hold yourself back from some of your worst urges. You're not going to say no to that temptation of corruption, that when somebody offers you money, the kind that you've never seen before, or that temptation for illicit sex, when they send you just the right shade of young lady that you know you really like, or that temptation to utilize the resources of the state or your company or your position to malign somebody just because you feel that they aggrieved you and didn't pay you the proper amount of respect. So definitely, pot-bellied leaders are bad for Africa. But that doesn't mean that every slim leader is good for Africa, which is what the question poser was saying. So, what do you do, and how do you recognize? How else can you recognize bad leadership or bad leaders? Now, it gets a little harder, I have to admit, because, and the reason why I love the potbelly the description is because it's very easy to see. It's fairly obvious. And let me say this as well. There are some exceptions where some people may have a potbelly because of health reasons, okay? And there may be some exceptions. But I will also say that there are a very, 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 very few. So let's get back to the question. How else can you recognize bad leaders? How else can you recognize? Well, certainly by their track record, okay? Somebody who wants to be a leader, look at what they have done before. And don't just take their word for it. Because as it always happens, like in an interview, nobody ever talks about the times they screwed up. And even if you ask them a question like, tell us about a time that you did something wrong and what you learned from it, usually they end up telling you some little minor thing that they did. So go and ask others who have been led by them. Ask people who have been led by them and have moved on to other facets of life. Ask about their results. Ask about whether those people have grown as a result. You see, the outcomes of good leadership are three things. Three things. Number one, trust. In an organization that is led by good leaders, you will find that the people who are led trust their leader, and the people who are being led trust each other. Why? Because the leader holds each of them accountable to performing their roles, so they can trust each other, even if they don't always like each other or love each other. So that's number one, trust is an outcome of good leadership, and you'll see it in their performance. Number two is hope. In organizations led by good leaders, you will see that the people there have hope of a better future. They are hopeful. They believe in the vision. They have a vision, first of all, that the leader has shared with them, and they have hope in that situation. That's number two. The third thing that you will see, the third fruit or outcome of good leadership is progress. So you will see in organizations, communities, countries which are led by good leaders, you will see that they are making progress. Okay? So everybody thinks about progress as the first outcome. Yes, you'll know that good leaders, you'll see things are good happening, but it's not enough to just make progress. You have to also have trust. You have to have hope amongst the people in the organization. Now, the reality is that those three things are not always obvious to see. You'll have to study the organization, study the place, go to the place where that leader led for a while for you to really understand. They're not as obvious as a potbelly. But I want to share one thing that happened recently. I went to an organization called Habitat for Humanity, which just lost its leader because the leader, Maurice Makolo, was just appointed by the President William Ruto to be the ambassador to Austria. And when I spoke to the people in that organization, it was clear that they knew that they had lost a good leader. They trusted each other. They had hope of a brighter future, and they had made progress. So let me move on, because I'm sure I'm taking too much time on the first question. All right, let's go to the next question. Okay, somebody asked, how do I start a business when I have nothing? Okay, this is a really fascinating one because I get this all the time. So let me just make this clear. Do not buy into the myth that you have nothing. Yes, you do have something. Okay? Everybody has something. You may not have $1 to your name, or 1 shilling, or 1 kobo, or 1 leon, or 1 cedi to your name, but you have your energy. You have life, you have health, you have friends, you have networks, you have contacts, you have family, and you have your brains. So, you don't just have nothing. Start with what you have. One of the things that I will always encourage, if you want to start a business, learn how to sell. Learn the sales part of a business. So you know what? If you want to start a business, whether it's in hospitality or a restaurant or something, go to a place that does that and get them to hire you to be the salesperson. Volunteer to be the salesperson. Tell them, listen, I will work for free, but you will give me a commission. Commissions only. There are very few companies or entrepreneurs that will say no to that. Go there, learn the business by learning how to sell and get customers. You can start. And through those customers, through your networks, you will actually get knowledge and you may get your first investors. So that's what I would say. That's how you start. Let's go to the next question. Somebody asked, how do you get to meet all these people that you have featured in your podcast? Wow. All right. So, aside from the fact that I'm in my early 50s and I've met quite a few people, but I think the biggest thing that has catalyzed this has been the organization of the Made in Africa Leadership Conference, which is an annual learning conference that we organize for African leaders. So we African leaders organize a 2-day learning conference for African leaders, and we organize it in Africa. We started it in 2019 in Kigali. And then 2020, we went virtual. 2021 was also virtual because of COVID. 22 was in Zambia. 23 was in Ghana. And 2024, in fact, it's going to be in Nairobi this June, 12th and 13th June. So if you're interested, definitely you should feel free to register for it. Now, for every one of these conferences, the brand promise is that every leader who comes to this conference will leave the conference having found a solution to at least one problem that is keeping his or her organization from achieving success. So, how do we do this? We do this by minimizing time spent in large auditoriums with one speaker and maximizing time spent in small group discussions with speakers and facilitators who ensure that knowledge is shared throughout the room. So as you can imagine, with each conference, we have between 12 to 22 speakers, okay? So we look for these guest speakers, and what do we look for? We look for people who are experiencing success in Africa. So basically, I have almost a database of close to 100 or more Africans who we have engaged with, who have agreed and been guest speakers at our conferences and have, by virtue of us choosing them, have been successful in various places. And what I'm doing, the podcast, is I frankly tap into some of those. Now, we also do feature some people who have not been guest speakers at the Made in Africa Leadership Conference before, but that's where I would say that I get a lot of my contacts and networks, and it's been an amazing journey. And again, let me just say this. If you haven't attended a Made in Africa Leadership Conference before, you really need to. You can register. It only costs $600. It's for the 2-day conference. That doesn't include accommodation. And this time it's going to be in Nairobi, so definitely register early. The link is going to be put on the screen so that you can do that. All right, I need to move fast because we're getting close to our time limit. Last question that I'm going to handle is, who are you and what gives you the authority to lecture us on how to be successful in Africa? Well, yeah, I picked this one because it was a little tongue-in-cheek, but I felt it was certainly the spirit of it deserves to be answered. And it's a fair question. Who am I? Okay? What makes me, Modupe Taylor Pierce, qualified to be delivering these learning tips on success in Africa? Well, a couple of things. Number one, I'm an African. Number two, I've studied this for many years. But also, I think part of my story is what gives me the passion for this and the competence. See, I learned about leadership at a very early age, yes, from my parents. But then I also saw leadership in action because I joined the army when I was 18 years old. And then I was recruited to attend the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, the place where the United States trains its best and brightest leaders. Immediately after that, I found myself back in Sierra Leone with the Sierra Leone Army, which I was a member of, serving in the Civil War. And barely 6 months after being back, I found myself one day in a situation where we lost 5 soldiers. We lost 5 soldiers because the battalion that I was commanding, one of the company commanders who suffered from a tragic addiction to alcohol, led his company out of the lanes that we had set for them. And on a rainy night, they actually ended up engaging with friendly unit. And 5 soldiers died. And what I realized that day when I was looking at these soldiers and we were going to bury them was that I kept asking myself, what was their crime? What was their crime? What did these soldiers do wrong that they deserved to die, that they died? And the only thing I could come up with was the fact that they served under a bad leader, a leader who made poor decisions. And that's when I realized that when leaders make poor decisions, people die. See, when leaders make poor decisions, people die, folks. And it's no different even in peacetime. You see, in wartime, it was clear to me because the lag time between the decision and the death was this close. In peacetime, the lag time is much longer. But make no mistake, when you make poor decisions, somebody's livelihood is going to be negatively impacted, which means they're going to die before their time. So this is where the passion came from for me to definitely study this. I had experienced this at West Point. I've experienced being a leader in a wartime. I've experienced being a leader as an entrepreneur. I've experienced being a leader in public sector on parastatal boards. I've experienced being a leader in corporate environments in North America, in Europe, in Africa. But my biggest passion is really Africa, and that is why I decided to study other leaders. And through this study, I have seen patterns that work within Africa. And that is why I am sharing this with you through the podcast. All right, that's as much time as we have for this episode. Wow, it's amazing. Time flies so fast. I only got through 4 questions. My apologies if I haven't chosen any of your questions. I hope to do this once every 3 months. We'll, pick the 13th episode because we do this weekly, so that we'll just pick a couple of the questions and just feature them in the podcast. Again, don't forget to subscribe. Remember, leadership matters. Leadership is a life and death issue. It really, really matters. And your first person you lead is yourself. So I want you to lead yourself to success. And if you've been listening here, congratulations, because you've already started that journey. I look forward to seeing you next week. We're going to resume our series on entrepreneurship, leaders in business situations, successful leaders in African business. Take care. Have a wonderful, wonderful week.
Tomorrow belongs to those people who prepare for it today. See you next week.